All right. Let's make sure I can advance. Good. Hi, everybody. My name is Dave Brinker. I work at IDHE, the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education at Tufts University, where we study the relationship between higher education and civic participation. And as part of that work, we run a study called NSOLVE, the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement. And that is a process for collecting data on student turnout in each general election. And from that data set, we produce a report for each of our about 1,100 participating campuses with student voting data. And today I want to talk a little bit about the three kind of principal rates that are reported and how to get a little more out of them. And I want to argue for you that most people put too much emphasis directly on the voting rate, because the voting rate is actually a second order metric. It's really composed of two other rates. So the voting rate is the number of eligible, percent of eligible students who voted in an election. But the registration rate is the percent of eligible students who are registered. And what we call the yield rate is the percent of registered students who voted. So when you multiply the registration rate by the yield rate, you get the voting rate. And this is a useful thing to know because it empowers you to get a lot more out of your data by looking at these two metrics. So one way you can get more out of your data is to ask what has happened in prior elections. And this is what it looks like over the totality of NSOLVE. Each campus will look a little different, but you can see that you might draw interesting conclusions. For example, that the difference between 2012 and 2016 really came down to an increase in registration, but the same, actually slightly lower percent of registered students really went and voted. Very different story in 2020, where we saw increases in both registration and yield. Another interesting way you can use these data is to understand the impact of goals you might set. So oftentimes people will set a registration rate goal. We want to increase our registration rate to this percent. Well, you can use this understanding to calculate what impact that will have on your voting rate. And what you will find if you do the math is that as those rates get higher, their relative impact diminishes on the voting rate. So if you already have a very high registration rate, you would face diminishing returns on increasing that registration rate without also increasing the yield, or the percent of registered students who actually vote. And being able to do that math is kind of neat. And then the one that usually people get excited about is to do a little scenario planning, right? So there's a complicated formula at the top that I won't really go through. It's actually not that complicated when you dig into it. But the point is you can use this knowledge to start predicting turnout rates. Not really predicting, but running scenarios. So in 2020, I ran what I called the status quo scenario. What if prior patterns replicate in this election year? An enthusiastic model, what happens if people really turn out in larger numbers than we'd expect, and an unenthusiastic model. And from that, I said, you know, the voting rate's going to be somewhere between 49% and 66%. It ended up being about 66% because enthusiasm was off the charts, right, for 2020. Just because people always ask me, and I want to preempt the question, when I run the midterms and 2022 will be the same model, I get a voting rate of about 51%. So don't ask me, that's my guess. And it won't be that, but that's what I'm anticipating. But I wanted to make sure that I left enough time in this, just 5 minutes to talk about the real reason that you would want to do this, right? So it's really fun to do the wonky kind of math around elections and turnout metrics and really diving into the reports. But our explicit goal with these reports is to open avenues for conversation and thinking about what will influence students' political learning experiences on campuses and how schools can support their students in that political learning process. So by thinking about the impacts of various forces, right, on registration and yield, and then charting them to see how that might affect voting, right, we can come up with kind of realistic expectations for future elections and what we'll do to support them. This year, I'm really focusing on wanting to talk about whether students will be able and willing to vote near campus, right, which affects both registration and yield. How are carryover bills going to affect specific jurisdictions? We know from Brennan Center research that most of these carryover bills from the last legislative cycle will make voting harder, especially by removing voters from voting rolls. So that's the thing to watch for. And then talking about the political climate, right? Student activism is high, but is it enthusiasm for democracy, or is it skepticism that democratic participation is worthwhile? So if you need any kind of support in having those conversations or in understanding your data, please reach out to us. You can find everything we have to offer on idhe.tufts.edu.
Hi, Dave. I'm a graduate assistant at the Center for Service Learning. My question is, what is your perception of younger people's faith in democratic institutions? Obviously, with the incident on January 6th and these anti-democratic bills, I know in my own circles as a younger person, I've seen some skepticism. I wonder what if you've seen in data and research along that line.
Yeah, I mean, I think the data confirm what you are experiencing, right? That enthusiasm for democratic representation or for the idea that your interests are really being not only represented, right, but that you have some influence, especially at the local level, right, is on the decline. And I think that the real problem isn't the perception. So this is what I always say about this. It's not the perception, it's that the perception might be right, that elected officials really aren't as responsive as we would hope, right? And the impact of things like voting really isn't as high as we might have been led to believe when we were younger. So I would say that that's actually the kind of realist view, is to say, in what ways are those doubts actually reflective of reality and problems to take care of?
I did have one question I wanted to ask, and I'll be asking this to all of the panelists, so you all can prepare for that too. So in terms of the data that you might have seen, whether it's for KU or on a national level, what is something that you would recommend to those of us that are doing this, voter engagement, voter registration work on the ground here at KU to do better in promoting and advocating for civic engagement, just based on what you've seen kind of through the data?
Sure. So, our data are so top line that they really only mean anything when they're in the context that they're, that they're analyzing. And so this is a way, I think that there's an opportunity for partnership with us. We give out a sort of limited number of data points, but they include things like field of study, race and sex, if they're provided by the institution, and age. And I think that there are useful conversations to be had, not just about how you fix gaps, right? Turnout gaps, for example, between sex and race groups, right? But where those are coming from and the kinds of cultures that we foster in higher ed, and really realistic ones, not just who's being marginalized, but who's routinely receiving messages that they are marginal, which are actually kind of a little bit different, right? One is systemic and one is a little more explicit. So I'm not sure that I'd say that anyone's doing a bad job of that. But those gaps do persist, and so being realistic about where they are coming from and how culture is leading to them is worthwhile, I think.